Good morning, Coldwell Banker George Realty. Thank you for attending this Friday training. We will be highlighting the changes that were made by the car attorneys at the end of last year on the lease listing agreement and the residential lease. Now, these are just going to be highlighting the changes. I realize we may have some new agents. We will be running training at least monthly on Tuesdays to go over all types of contracts with new agents or agents returning to business. And just a quick announcement, we did half of the residential purchase agreement last Tuesday at 2. We will conclude that training this upcoming Tuesday at 2 to get through the whole residential purchase agreement. And for the new people, we will continue on at least monthly on Tuesdays to train all of the contracts. So I'm going to get started with the changes, and this is only the changes on the lease listing agreement. So you'll see here after the security deposit, they've referenced a security deposit addendum that we should see this CAR form for more information. I do have that populated in the next form, and it shows us allowable amounts for a security deposit. And it also reminds the property owner to take pictures of the unit prior to renting it or film it. That's a really good advice for the owner. Okay, so that's your first change here. And this compensation on B, it's again reminding the property owner that this does not include any compensation to the broker representing the tenant. It's only the listing agent. This is a lease listing agreement for residential. Okay, so that's those two changes. Now let's look at this security deposit disclosure and addendum form. I think we should populate this on all listing agreements and have the seller, the owner and the tenant sign. It's a good form just so everybody understands. The limit is 1 month security deposit, but there are some exceptions to that rule on certain type of property owners, and you will see the exceptions down here on number 2. The landlord is a natural person, and these two conditions must exist for the exception that the landlord is a natural person or an LLC in which all members are natural persons, okay, people alive, and the landlord owns, and it's not an entity, the landlord owns no more than 2 residential rental properties that collectively include no more than 4 dwelling units offered for rent on those properties. So that means that if these 2 conditions are met, there is an exception to the 1 month rule, okay? But even if there is an exception, the armed forces gets the exception for a 1 month rent. So this isn't a new form. I'm just kind of going over it for you. So if they are armed services, the broker representing the tenant would check the box and check which armed services they're part of. Okay, so they get that exception no matter if the property owner met the exceptions in number 2, providing their armed services. Okay, so that's not a new form, just going over it a little as a refresher. So we're going to drop down here. Okay, so the compensation obligations to tenant brokers. This is nice for you to point out to the property owner, and that is that many tenants do not have sufficient funds to pay the security deposit, first month's rent, and then also turn around and pay compensation to their agent. So that is an advisement to the property owner, but there's ways we can handle getting the tenant's agent paid. Okay, so that's a nice reminder. You can point that out. My agreement always only says whatever percentage you put in, 3, 4, whatever percent. However, Miss Property Owner, I want to remind you that if the tenant is represented by me or another agent, they will request commission on the other side for the tenant. So you always want to be letting the owner know, because you don't want to surprise them where they think, oh, yay, the whole thing's only going to cost me 3 or 4%, when you know there'll be a request coming in for the other side's commission. So always remind them, don't surprise them. Because mainly things happen because we surprise somebody. But if we tell them up front, it's not a problem. So here's on 12B, the property owner agrees to complete a rental property intake form. And I have attached it. I'll show you within 3 days of request by the broker, or this form is attached. So you'll see down here, they did not automatically check this box, because you can either do it with the listing agreement, which I think you should, or and check it in, or you can collect it 3 days later. It's probably better to check it in, check this box and get it as you list the property. Take some time with the owner and go over the form. The entity, I'm not going to address this too much. They've just rearranged the numbering here to make it an easier flow, but it's the same information if it happens to be an entity property owner, okay? So this form is RPQI, Rental Property Owner Intake Form, and this form is not intended to be provided to the tenants. It's to be provided to with a property management agreement or a lease listing agreement, but not with the lease, okay? So we will not be providing this form with the lease agreement. So you can take your time with the client. Yeah. And then just get all these questions answers as to the best of the property owner's knowledge. And make sure that here, if carbon monoxide and smoke and strapping of the water heater, even for rentals, please make sure those are in place for the tenant. Okay. Strapping of the water heater, smoke detection alarms, and carbon monoxide detectors. When you're leasing a property and talking to the owner, just make sure that they have those items in place in the property, that they're working, that the batteries don't need to be changed. We want to turn it over with operating detectors, okay? So they've added a little bit to this form since last time, which is good. They've added some questions about pool or spa safety, which are all contained right here, that the seller, the property owner can go over and check what's applicable. And coming down here, this isn't a new form, but I just want to point one more thing out that they've added. They've added a section for wood balconies and stairs. So that's a new question on 23. So I do recommend that you get this filled out at the time of your listing. Okay, so just so that we're not confused, there is a rental property owner disclosure, which is intended to be provided with a residential lease. See, and it says right here, and with the residential lease. There aren't changes to this. I'm just making the distinction to you. Just read the top of the forms. One's to go with the lease and one's just to go with the listing, okay? So no changes here, just making you aware. So we've went over the changes in the lease listing agreement. We are going to move to the residential lease, or month to month. There's not a lot of changes. So let me pull this up. So this is the residential month-to-month rental agreement that they updated at the end of the year. Like I said, there are not a lot of changes. We do have a new form they brought in. If I'm making you sick scrolling, excuse me, let me get to my highlights, okay? Okay, this is just a few words they added. I'm not going to go over that. It's not really too much. So this is a whole new section, number 42. And what page is that? It is page 7. Okay, so 42, the broker's compensation. This is right in the lease. So existing rent agreements, upon execution of this agreement, the tenant compensation to tenant's broker, if it's applicable, tenant agrees to pay the compensation specified in a separate written agreement, that is your TRBC or LCA, or the owner compensation to tenant's broker, the owner will agree to pay. And if the owner agreement to pay, you check this box here, and it's in consideration of the tenant entering, the owner agrees to pay. Now let me back up. That means that you do need to have your TRBC, your tenant representation. Don't show property without those, because if you don't have an agreement, you could be missing out on some commission. So you do need to have that, but like with purchases, you can ask the owner to pay the tenant's broker's compensation. So just think of it the same way as you do on a purchase. So it goes over the terms here. A fixed term lease, how many percent? Month to month, how many percent? Or on month to month, maybe you charge a flat fee because it's a month to month. Maybe it's a short term and you want a flat fee for your work, so you may charge a flat fee. Payment is considered, and it tells you both that the tenant taking possession of the premises is when the payment is due, okay? Or let's say the housing provider prevented them from taking possession through no fault of the tenant or agents, then the commission would still be due, okay? So there's a box down here that you could check, and you do need to get permission. So what you could do is payment of compensation to the agency can come right out of the buyer's move-in funds, excuse me. So you would put the payments here, how much to the tenant's broker, how much to the housing provider, property manager. So you would put the amounts here that are going to be pulled out of the compensation, the funds, the initial funds coming in. But make sure you're doing the math right before you go and get all this signed, because you're going to back the compensation to the tenants out of the initial funds. You're going to instruct the tenant of the amounts of each cashier check. So in theory, that tenant may come in with 3 cashier's check, right? Because maybe there's 2 different brokerages involved, and then there's a property owner that's going to need the remaining balance. But do address this way ahead of time with your client on if they prefer to do that. Most landlords I've worked with do not prefer to do it that way, but that doesn't mean there's some out there that don't mind if you explain it to them, okay? So they've added this section in. This is all new. I recommend that you take a deeper dive. Look at that when you are doing a lease agreement, okay? If you are in a lease agreement or preparing one and you need help, just give us a call. We're here to help you, okay? So if you look at 46, offer of tenant, positive rental payment reporting, I have attached the form because I was like, what is that? So we're going to go over it, okay? So that's an automatic check. The entity, again, they just rearranged it around. It's the same information to make better sense. Okay. So before I get to that new form, broker compensation, we're signing here, housing provider's broker and tenant's broker agrees to accept the compensation as specified in 42 or in a separate written agreement. So right here, by signing, we are agreeing to that compensation, okay? If there is a separate written agreement that resides only, the listing agent will have theirs, right? But you may want to send in a compensation agreement if it is not outlined for what you're expecting as a tenant's rep, okay? So offer of tenant, positive rental payment reporting. This is this form. So what this form is doing is it's saying that the tenant has a right to request that the housing provider report positive rental payments to a nationwide consumer reporting agency. Now, the tenant can request the housing report that they report this, and the housing provider shall comply with this request to the nationwide reporting in either of the following two scenarios, okay? So here you go. That this property is located with 16 or more units, okay? The property is located in a premises with 15 or fewer units, and both of the following apply. So you really need to look at all four of these. The housing provider owns more than one residential rental property, regardless of the number of units. And the housing provider is a real estate investment trust, corporation, or LLC, in which at least one member is a corporation. So you need to take a look at these exceptions here. Housing provider is not required to provide, but may voluntarily comply with this form. Or if the housing provider has looked at these exceptions here and they tell you that they're not required to report, make sure that they are filling this out and checking the box. Okay. So to me, this is a little confusing till I kept rereading it, but just pay attention in B so that you can point this out to the owner. And if there is an exception, they can check D, that they're not required, okay? So if you come down in the name of reporting agencies, if they're required, the tenant can elect TransUnion, etc., to report. How the tenant can opt in, it tells them how they can opt in. Or this form was provided to the tenant by first class mail, and tenant may opt in for positive reporting. So make sure when you are doing the leases, and it is checked into the lease agreement that this is included, we will add it to our checklist as well. Okay, so I'll leave it to you. Now, service fee. I wanted to point this out. Tenant shall pay the housing provider a monthly service fee of, you insert amount, but it cannot exceed $10 monthly, or the actual cost, whichever is lower, okay? So, or they can check no monthly fee. You know, so you can see this can be kind of tricky for somebody to be keeping track of this, but, and nevertheless, we need to provide this with the leases, okay? So
aside from the rent is a service fee.
Yeah, aside from the rent as a service fee, if this opt-in, if the tenant opts in and the housing provider is not exempt from providing this, okay? So just make sure at the top you want that the housing provider tells you if they are. If they're not exempt, the housing provider signs here, right? That they've emailed it or sent it by first class mail, or it was part of the lease. And then the tenant here may opt in or opt out, okay? Okay, so I will try to understand the form a little bit better. Like how would we do that? We are not the property managers, but I'll try to at least get an idea in case a housing provider asks us. I'll talk to a couple property management companies how you would direct them that they can report it, because it wouldn't be something we as agents would be doing. We are not a property management company. We do no functions of property management, and we don't have errors and omission insurance for that. So, but I'll try to find out from a couple of management companies how the owner would report that if they have to, okay? So are there any questions? Anybody in Zoom have questions? Okay, so again, these are just highlighting the changes. Newer agents, you will need to be attending the Tuesday classes that we will run either once a month or bi-weekly, so that we go over each paragraph of the contracts, because the knowledge that you gain on contracts will give you, you know, a lot of power in your negotiation. It'll make you comfortable and confident. One other thing, when you are representing or leasing a unit, I recommend that you take the applications, lay them on the counter. You have a list of all the things you're going to collect from the tenant. That list must be the same from each tenant. For instance, a government issued ID, a fully completed application and an application fee. Don't vary what you require from tenant to tenant. Make yourself a list, lay it by the applications in the unit, and collect the exact same documentation from each client. Now, if somebody calls you and asks for an application on the unit, just give them the application, because the landlord is the one that will make the decision, excuse me, the property owner. So make sure that you're just providing the application. You're a conduit to collecting the information for the property owner, and we don't want to block anybody in obtaining an application ever. So let everybody that asks have an application, and it will be up to the property owner to review each application and make their decision, not our decision, okay? So we don't want to decide up front who's getting an application. Give everybody an application. Any questions? Any comments? I know this is a shorter class. Because somebody was going into a lease listing agreement, so I told them I'd pull this one up. So next week we'll be going over any changes in the residential disclosures. I'll be highlighting any changes in the disclosure forms or any additional disclosure forms that are required. So if there's no questions, we will conclude early today. And I thank you all for your time and wish you a wonderful weekend.
Hello, Michelle.
Thank you.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes, it's recorded.
Okay.
Hi, Sylvia.
I'm Peggy with Coldwell Banker.
Oh, hi, Peggy.
Yeah, very nice to have such a kind of class to let all the agents to update it for the new information. But
Yeah.
regret, I just saw the email about 10:15, so I missed almost the most important parts.
Which
I would
one? I'm
appreciate.
sorry, there was
Yeah.
talking. Peggy, I missed what you said. You missed what?
Okay, I mean, I would be appreciate if there's if in the future